one, go.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to this beautiful community. My name is Marina Rodríguez Neves, and I'm a member of the Digital Futures Young Committee and the moderator of today's event, The Death of Culture. It is a pleasure for the team and myself being here with a group of smart, talented, and extremely sharp thinkers, designers, and architects that I'm sure will make this debate vivid and provocative. I want to show my gratitude to Daniel Cardoso Llach, Sylvia Lavin, Leach, Sanford Quinter, Ciro Najle, and Enrique Walker for being here, and especially to all the Digital Futures collaborators for your generosity in helping us to create a new neural connection to this global brain. After launching a very brief set of questions, I will introduce our speakers in order of presentation. The speakers will present in 10 minutes each, and then we will open the conversation to the audience and the rest of the Digital Futures team to make questions. For this event, I prepare a short introduction to frame the topic and lay out a few provocations. The dead has been resuscitated. However, the culture of death announced a series of necroses without succeeding in killing anything. It is possible to enumerate and classify different types of death. The hybrid deaths, half disciplinary and half conceptual, like Charles Schenk's Death of Modern Architecture. The death of the monument by Lewis Mumford. The death of concepts, such as Caroline Merchant's Death of Nature. And the death of certain characters, such as the death of the author by Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault, which has been followed in architecture. And why not the predicted death of the architect in the context of AI? There are also some catastrophic endings that can ascribe to the series of death, such as the death of the classical, the end of history, the end of theory, and the so imagined end of the disciplines. Thinking about the death of something presents us with the beautiful challenge of posing some questions. To start with, has culture ever been alive? Maybe the death of culture at the death of architecture is a new naive intent of giving reified generalities the condition of being alive. Maybe the question about the death of something that could not be alive is a new definition of the borders between life and death. The death of culture is not an announcement or a premonition. It is the fact that it's time to resuscitate the death as a contradiction. So, is the death of culture the beginning of something new? New assemblages emerge with cybernetic and information technologies, pharmaceutical innovations, genetic manipulation, and molecular engineering. Their cognate expressions are the blasphemous, ironic, but also politically correct cyberpunks and biopunks, which changed from late capitalism to biocapitalism, redefining the borders of modernism and humanism. Male or female, body or mind, culture or nature, human and animal, white or non-white, the self or the other. So the culture of death and endings as a fatal strategy of pushing the argument to the extreme always seems to generate an impact. The impact of knowing that something has ended, that is irremediably dead. Hence, the complexity of resurrecting death, and the question, how death as a singularity becomes a repetition. What is the model of serial endings? Has been dead overused and betrays a lack of original thought? If the death is a cliche, it might be because cliches seems to outlive all deaths. So thank you very much. I will introduce our speakers today in order of presentation. First, I'm so excited to present Sylvia Lavin. She is a critic, curator, historian, and theorist whose work explored the limits of architecture across a wide spectrum of historical periods. Sylvia published several books, which include Architecture Itself and Other Postmodernization Effects, the catalog to an exhibition held in the CCA, among others. And she's a professor of architecture at Princeton University, and she's currently working on a book about tree. So Sylvia, the space is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for the gracious invitation. I was not entirely sure what our purpose is today, so I'm a little flummoxed having to go first because I'm not quite sure what the ground is that I am expected to establish. But to try to link to the introduction, perhaps I'll just very quickly retitle, which is our capacity in the digital age, right? We can meme endlessly by simply putting a new caption on old pictures. So I will recaption my presentation now, digital research and the rebirth of history, just to try to do some parallel play. So I have just a couple of very short remarks that I throw out mostly to have something to talk about with you all later on. So I speak to you right now as a historian, and as a historian who, like many of you, have spent the last year doing all my work through a digital interface. So we all do that all the time, I suppose, but we have historically had areas of our activity where we drop out of the screen to deal with other kinds of things, whether it's a client or a site, or in my case, an archive or a book. One of the conditions that frames my few remarks is the fact that over the past year, the internet has been disgorging an almost grotesque quantity of data. Almost every scrap of paper in virtually every archive of a significant size has now been digitized. It turns out that many more books than we had ever imagined have long since been digitized. And just to be provocative for a moment, I would say there really isn't much research that you can't do anymore through your screen. So the whole, let's call it romantic myth of discovery in the archive, in the physical, dusty, musty archive. On the one hand, that seems to be a myth that has died, and I'm curious about that fact. So here are a few comments on this subject. So there is a growing scholarly literature being produced on the 1980s, which tends to characterize that as the last decade during the which the discipline could still fully, if falsely, imagine itself to be dominated by an analogic framework. A self-image motivated, at least in part, by two forms of technological resistance. On the one hand, a retrospective technique of the technocratic legacy of the Second World War, as well as an anticipatory anxiety about the coming and in the many ways already present, if only secretly, digital age. One important way in which this was manifest was through a privileging of history, as if long historical narratives stretching back in time might be a way to roll back the technological clock. History became longer and longer as modernity was pushed back first into the 18th century and eventually all the way back to the Renaissance. So strong was this pull that architects abandoned practice right and left to become historians. to become builders of archives, to become museum directors, to become, in other words, not only the keepers of history, but the producers of architecture as history. The effort to keep architecture analogic produced not, in my mind, what Tafuri called operative criticism, but in fact, a deep entanglement between architects, and architects become historians like Tafuri. By the 1990s, this entanglement was no longer seen as a solution to the technocratic conditions of the post-war and the technological anxieties of the dawning digital age, but rather as the producer of a whole series of what then began to be called false narratives. False narratives and theory. Theory itself, portable, agile, tactical, suspicious, evasive, and elusive, entered the scene to disrupt this long historical ideology. Much like the new and increasingly digital platforms that operated to disseminate the theoretical project, theory, which I use in quotation marks, was as much as anything else a series of operations that established networks of concepts through which media philia replaced techno-anxiety, and the endlessly projective vicissitudes of discourse eventually converted history into an ideological structure to be dispensed with. During the past 10 to 15 years, theory's very portability, which was necessary to its dislodging function with respect to the overly intimate contact between architects and historians of the 1980s. Theory's disengagement from material conditions and its isomorphism with the very digital technologies it sought to engage. And finally, and perhaps above all, its susceptibility to invention and fabrication radically weakened theory as a position and even made it a target of new forms of historicism. This is the history reborn. Today's history, unlike that of the 1980s, however, is highly empirical, seeks to stay close to evidence and to documents, and as far away from practice and design as possible. It does not theorize, but rather operates methodologically. On the one hand, this makes sense. In the post-truth world, a way of confronting evidence-based research seems increasingly essential. I wish you could see all the quotation marks around these words that I hope it's clear, I'm taking from CNN, right? This is the discourse of the news these days. So in the post-truth world, a way of confronting, quote, evidence-based research seems increasingly essential. On the other hand, as we have witnessed in an accelerated fashion during the past year, where I began, everything has been digitized. Every scrap of data, every document in the archive is at least theoretically universally available. If not actually available now, its theoretical possibility of uninterrupted publication is present. Forms of positivism are creeping into design discourse, and a new technocracy is emerging. Exhibitions, an arena in which I work, by the way, take the same kind of positivism as they are produced increasingly through the compilation of massive quantities of data made available for viewers to scan, sort, and serf. The facts speak for themselves in today's history, at least in theory, as research becomes the generic lingua franca for architectural activity. Insofar as we are being asked to discuss the future then, I am interested perhaps less in the documents and research as such than I am in the kinds of confidence we must build, in the kinds of narrative structures we must reinvent, the ways of working with materials that we need to regulate in order to avoid the aestheticization of research activities that we see around us, and to produce instead histories that are as speculative as they are concrete. Thank you.
That was beautiful, super interesting and provocative, Sylvia. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I have a lot of questions and comments, but we need to move on now to our next presenter today, speaker. And he is Daniel Cardoso Llach. He's an associate professor in the School of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon University, where he chairs the Master of Science in Computational Design and co-directs the Computational Design Laboratory. His work examines issues ranging from social and cultural aspects of automation in design and construction, the politics of representation and participation in software, a new method to understand design as social-technical phenomenon. It comprised publication, exhibition, and technologies, including the book Builder of the Vision, Software and the Imagination of Design. And Daniel holds a PhD and MS with honors from MIT and professional architectural degree from Universidad de los Andes in Bogota. So thank you, Daniel. Space is yours now.
Thank you so much, Marina, and thank you, Sylvia, for an amazing opening for this event. And it's so great to see everyone, Sanford and old friends and mentors. So I will share my screen. If that's okay. So my talk is called AI Enlivenment. And I have to admit that I struggled a bit to relate to the topic of the panel. My first thought was that death is not a metaphor in a time of a pandemic, and that many of us know people who have fallen ill or died because of the virus. At the same time, or on the other hand, I should say, culture, I understand culture as the inevitable result of human interaction. So I think it's pretty much alive despite these two-dimensional lattices that we are confined to these days. As this conversation, of course, shows. Perhaps we can say that rather, instead of dying, what we call culture has to some extent adapted or morphed to new habitats, at least for those of us who are lucky enough to work on things that can be transmitted digitally, like Sylvia's mention of archival work and research conversations such as these ones. So in the spirit of a provocation, I want to start by arguing or making the case for AI discourse to configure a way of understanding and representing the world that has been emptied of life. So this is how I'm trying to kind of approach the subject of the panel. That by representing the world as a field for automated processes of data extraction and analysis and inference that often render human experience not as an open-ended and contingent phenomenon, but rather as an opportunity for labor and knowledge extraction. These discourses, the AI discourse that has become a little dominant in architectural design, is emptying life out of our understanding of the built environment and other things, in ways that, of course, resonate with the work of recent scholars like Shoshana Zuboff's ideas about surveillance capitalism, or notions of managerial optimization that we see in everywhere from Amazon to smart city discourses, to current efforts to use machine learning and computer vision to surveil construction work. So I want to give a name to this death that I see lurking, and I'm going to call it a thanatic epistemology. I think that this kind of discourse configures a thanatic epistemology of design and construction, and I want us to be able to talk about it and think of ways around it. Because underneath the hype and the animistic tropes of machines behaving like humans and thinking like humans, this worldview is problematic. I don't know if the video is running. Let me see. Yeah. So approaches to design that are linked to the recent resurgence of AI are often framed in a rhetoric that emphasizes the automated aspects of the work, while at the same time hiding the laborious, time and energy intensive processes that make it possible. And this, of course, builds on a long tradition of computer experimentalism in architecture and design. And the result of that are these kind of automated utopias of robots that build buildings and algorithms that design things and so on, frequently framing these technologies as human-like or as living entities that are part of the biological world. But of course, machines are not alive, and so rather than actual ecosystems, these are carefully staged acts of puppetry. And of course, as we also know, algorithms, no matter how much data they masticate, they are not intelligent in any meaningful sense of the word, but respond to statistical calibrations of their design and to the specific data that they are fed. These are expressions of what Luciana Parisi has called technological decisionism. And these images express a desire for a world without human intervention, or at least a world where human intervention and decision-making, in other words, politics, is concealed by a combination of technological imagery and rhetoric that presents technical systems as inherently neutral or objective. And what I want to suggest today is that there is a lot to gain by critically and creatively making the hands, animating these puppets visible, so to speak. So rather than cutting down or severing the ties of computational systems with their social, material, and ecological and historical substrates, we should try to kind of open them up and relish on their specificity and their own provincialism. And that's a lot of what my work in general tries to do. But and I have a particular interest in these questions. I run a program in the School of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon where we try to rethink the role of computing in processes of designing and making and building. And we are especially interested in how digital technologies are imagined as participants or as modulators or enablers of design processes, and in approaching these imaginaries as worthy subjects of critical inquiry and creative intervention. So from this perspective, the move to cast design as a subject of automation or optimization or predictive inference, and the conceptual shifts that these moves inscribe for notions of architecture, labor, and human life in general deserve careful scrutiny. So what are we saying when we say that something was designed by an algorithm? What do we mean when a given design software is represented as an architectural partner or slave? What desires about labor and about society do we express when we imagine autonomous construction, quote unquote, or when we imagine that humans and robots will somehow collaborate? So we have almost no time, so I'd like to kind of propose three conceptual moves to critically think about these questions in the context of architecture and design. And I will try to illustrate them very briefly with quick vignettes of recent works coming from my research group, which I offer not as solutions, but as materials for discussion in these three specific arenas that I'm trying to describe. One is that codification and translation are creative practices. Second, that we need to embrace a a specific kind of methodological and disciplinary hybridity enabled by computational systems. And third, that we should learn to explore the interruptive potentials at the interface. And I'll try to kind of clarify this a little bit. As science and technology studies remind us, rather than objective and neutral, data are laboriously designed and constructed. They are enmeshed with and at the same time shape their social and material settings. As architects, I think it is important, and architectural scholars, I should say, it is thus important to recognize codification, the construction of this data, the design of these data artifacts as a creative practice worthy of critical consideration. And I will illustrate this broad notion with a concept that we call architectural distant readings, which is a project in my research group led by Cecilia Ferrando, where we explored algorithmic methods to experiment with different kinds of architectural analysis. So one thing to mention is that we're inspired in this project by research in the digital humanities that has explored the concept of distant reading to describe computational analysis of entire corpuses of work. So not just the work of one author or one novel or so on, but entire sort of genres or periods in literary history. So they oppose the concept of close reading to this concept of distant reading to study the specificities of variations across large bodies of work. So we're trying to ask, what would that mean in the context of architectural analysis and architectural scholarship? What would an architectural distant reading look like? There's no time to go into the details of the project. I will remark on the fact that what was most interesting here was the laborious, time-intensive construction of the dataset of buildings that we ended up using, which involved tracing and retracing dozens of buildings that were then represented as graphs and nodes with individual spaces as links indicating spatial connectivity. So this was a very manual practice that informed this particular algorithmic performance that enabled us to look at typological variation across a number of buildings and think through that question of distantly reading architectural work. And this enabled us to find correlations between the spatial structure of a number of buildings and typological and functional traits in those categories. Here, machine learning methods are not used to reproduce style, to kind of reconstruct a particular aesthetics in architecture, but rather as a resource in asking a question about architectural typology and its variation. The second conceptual move that I'm proposing, or that I'm putting on the table for conversation, concerns disciplinary and methodological hybridity. Computational methods always worked in conjunction with other knowledge domains and draw from a broad range of conceptual and methodological toolkits. Computational design, from my perspective, is not a discipline as much as an interdiscipline, emerging in the interstices of other fields. So there is no formula for creatively putting together different forms of expertise in motion in the wild, nor to access methodological or disciplinary hinterlands effectively through computational methods. And here I'm excited to share the screen, I should say, with Neil, whose work has been so kind of inspiring in this regard. So in this project, for example, we are exploring questions about how urban data is represented and how new kinds of data representation of urban information may allow for different kinds of questions and analysis. This project, which was led by Jean Maury at the Computational Design Lab, we used T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, or TSNEs, as a dimensionality reduction technique to create a sort of flatter representation of 48,000 buildings in the Pittsburgh urban area and analyze them in their immediate urban context. So to put it simply, instead of analyzing formal traits in discrete kind of building units, we were looking at the relationship of building units with their immediate urban context and trying to think about or think through the kinds of questions and analysis that type of technical approach would enable us. What was, I think, most enriching in this project was that, well, this technique produced a really interesting sort of redistricting of Pittsburgh, a new kind of morphological gradient of the city that revealed very interesting boundaries that did not correspond with the intuitive understanding of the city from our own experience and from the historical materials that we had. There was a back and forth between the archives of the city, walking through the city, taking photographs, and the algorithmic analysis that I find important to in the context of this conversation. It was the way in which this project was enlivened by this disciplinary hybridity and methodological hybridity. Finally, and to finish this short presentation, the third conceptual move I'm suggesting has to do with the interruptive potentials at the interface. The design of interfaces for users to interact with data in AI and machine learning contexts, offering opportunities for slowing down computational processes rather than making things faster. And we try to discover opportunities for creative interruptions, slowing down of these processes to support new kinds of creative exploration, I should say. I illustrate this with a project developed at the lab as well by Erik Ullberg, which explores new ways of interacting with a convolutional neural network that affords users fine-grained control over an algorithm's behavior. So Erik was inspired by the notion of craft, and he was wondering, can we actually interact with a neural network in a way that feels more like, like modeling something with your hands? And so he developed these interface tools to kind of slow down the neural network and be able to kind of fine-tune the filters, the kernels of the graph kernels of the neural network in order to shape the detective capacities of the neural network and shape the outcomes. And he developed two computational tools for developing that, for accomplishing that created this very interesting and playful interaction that ended up in some intriguing, strange drawings. What is important here is that the interface actually slows down the process, which is typically in the background, and facilitates a new kind of engagement with the computational process. So to finish with these examples, I try to kind of offer a few things for our conversation, try to suggest ways to enliven the way we think about these algorithms that are often represented as neutral, objective, or black boxed somewhere else, and more as something that is material and that they have their own plasticity, a plasticity that is related to the way in which data themselves are collected, visualized, manipulated, and analyzed. And I think that there are new kinds of authorial agency there for people in our fields, in architecture, design, practice, as well as scholarship to explore. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel. I have a lot of questions about your presentation, also about your book. But now we need to move on to the next presenter. The speaker is Neil Leach. Neil Leach is a professor at Tongji University and FIU and AGS, and he has also taught in the Architectural Association in Columbia University, Cornell, and Harvard, SciArc, and USC. He's an academician at the Academy of Europe. He has published 40 books on architectural theory and digital design, including the last ones about architecture in the age of artificial intelligence and what is coming next, the Death of the Architect. So thank you, Neil. It's an honor to have you here. Anyway, you have you every week because you are the founder of Digital Future with Philip Young, who is here as well. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks, Marina. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to Daniel and Sylvia for their fantastic presentations. It's great to know, Marina, that the future of theory is in good hands with people like you. It's fantastic to know this. So I'm going to try and keep this within the time limits, and the theme is, put simply, is the death of the architect. The reason why I use that title is because I'm working on a book about the moment. Maybe I could just kind of give you one glimpse of why I think that's going to happen in some ways. This was me boarding a flight at LAX to Shanghai, and I came along with my boarding pass. I showed it to the flight attendant. She said, don't give me that, just look at the screen. I looked at the screen in the middle image here, and then suddenly it had noticed me, recognized me from everyone else on the planet, and had told me which my seat was. This was the moment where I thought that I began to realize that AI was incredibly good, but terrifyingly good. So anyway, I'm in the situation now. I've just completed a manuscript about a couple of months ago for the first of 2 book series with Bloomsbury, Architecture in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. The first book, it'll come out in late October, and the one I'm about to start on, I haven't actually started writing it yet, is going to be called The Death of the Architect. I'm kind of along with Elon Musk. I see AI as being both incredible but also terrifying. Actually, I don't buy into the kind of the kind of technological determinism of surveillance arguments and so on. I don't think necessarily in and of itself that AI is bad. It's a question of how you use it. But anyway, so we have these 2 books. One has got a white cover about how positive AI is, like The Angel, and one has got a black cover about the dark side of AI, about the death of the architect. So I want to start by saying that my first book was the translation from the Latin of Alberti's book on architecture, written around 1450. And this is where our understanding of the architect was set out. On page 1 of this first ever published book, because it was published before Vitruvius, the first ever published book, Alberti defines what the architect is, as a kind of intellectual who's in charge of the whole operation, as it were. Now, since then, of course, the death of the architect has been announced by a number of people, not least FAT, and I won't go into their arguments, but suffice it to say that that notion of the architect as being someone totally in charge of the whole operation has already evaporated. Now the architect, instead of as Alberti would put it, the workman as being a tool in the hand of the architect is now a tool in the hand of the developer, of the contract manager, and so on. Most projects, certainly in the UK, are now done by design build. So, and I want to pick up on Helen Frisch's work. I mean, I really admire her, but I think she's probably wrong on this particular thing, where she looks at the death of architectural theory coming out as a result of the use of computation. Aside from the fact that she's referring to swarm theory in this particular article, which is a form of theory anyway, I want to argue that actually what's happening now with AI we're getting a real rebirth of theory, partly because the whole discourse is so quintessentially philosophical, because you have to address the question of consciousness, but also because, as I want to argue today, AI becomes a mirror in which we can begin to understand what it is to be human. And I want to particularly look at the question about what we understand of human creativity. Sanford heard some of the earlier thoughts about this in the summer, and he dismissed much of it as a sea of platitudes. I must say it's still probably for platitudes, but maybe less than before. So I want to focus on one particular kind of question, the issue of creativity. And of course, I know about Margaret Bowden, all those other people have written about creativity. I think we need to revise this notion. So I want to start by the obvious kind of question: can machines be creative? Of course, it depends on what you mean by creative, and I certainly buy into the argument maybe we should take into account consciousness. You can't be creative unless you're aware you're being creative. But there is a very negative attitude out there about AI as simply being a kind of imitation, a repetition of the same. It can't do anything that is very creative. This being one example, a recently published book by Joanna Zielinska, which is very pejorative. Within an architectural community, this has been echoed in some ways by Makoto Watanabe, but he's more open-minded, and he holds out the possibility that actually machines could be creative. But this is something that he wrote in 2016, where he kind of makes the comment that people are the only ones who can create an image that does not yet exist. Machines do not have dreams. What do we mean by dreams exactly? I won't answer that question, but I want to just simply on a straightforward level point out that style GANs and other forms of generative adversarial networks are already able to hallucinate images of people who do not yet exist. Equally, we can see, this is an example of the work of Wan Yu He of XCool. We can see that that AI is able to hallucinate buildings that do not yet exist. And just to show the very latest kind of material coming out from this is the work of Korp Himmelblau. Wolf Prix presented this on our DDES session 3 weeks ago, where they have, working with Daniel Bolojan, they have begun to develop a form of design process that is, in a sense, automated using style GANs and other forms of GANs to open up the possibility of how we might rethink the question about architectural culture. Another person who's very obsessed with these questions is Tom Main. My students have been working on Morphosis work. This is very early stuff, looking at how you can begin to take the notion of combinatorial studies and filter it through the logic of AI and start generating some novel approaches. This is the work of Nico, one of my thesis students at FIU, Florida International University. But the real question to my mind, leaving aside the question of what is exactly creativity, is whether human beings are so creative. I was invited to write the counterpoint essay for this particular AD on digital property, where the concern was with the issues of copyright might go out the window as soon as you can replicate certain aspects of certain designs and certain writings. Well, my view is that copying actually is intrinsic to what it is to be human. Much of human culture, if you think about the meme as originally coined by Richard Dawkins, it's about how culture spreads through a form of kind of imitation, catch tunes, the way that things catch on, how they become popular. It's all about sort of replicating some form of behavior and kind of spreading it virally in a kind of horizontal sort of way. So I personally think that humans themselves are already in many ways fundamentally linked to imitation. The comment that Adorno makes, the human is indissolubly linked to imitation. A human becomes human at all by imitating other human beings. And even when we think about the way in which we are inspired by our environment, which is, I wouldn't say necessarily a form of copying, but we are, nothing comes from nowhere, as it were. And you can see how someone like Johan Utzon is able to generate a design for the Sydney Opera House by being inspired by the sails of yachts on the harbour of Sydney. And to my mind, I think we overrate the degree to which humans can be creative. I think about architecture as being a bit like the logic of jazz. There is a kind of background condition of which we play in some way. We kind of vary it a bit, then we go back to that thing, but we never do something too outrageous. If you were to design something that was completely unheard of before, the example I always give is a building looks like a pineapple, someone would dismiss it and they'd say, oh no, that's not architecture. It's got to be somehow close to something. It's got to look a little bit like Zaha or Rem or Frank Gehry or something like that. Not be exactly the same, but somehow be a slight variation on that. So in my mind, I think we have to question whether we're whether we're as creative as we think we are. And even when there are game changers, and on the left-hand side of Frank Gehry's Guggenheim in Bilbao, even when there are game changers, we then find that actually those architects often repeat the same things in later works. On the right-hand side, the Disney Concert Hall in LA. It's almost like human beings are kind of constrained, a bit like pieces on a chessboard, to operate in a certain sort of way. We all have our signatures. By that I mean not simply the actual signature when we sign a check or something, but signatures in terms of how we speak, how we operate, how we design, how we walk, everything is kind of based on a kind of a sort of signature of some kind in a way. So one of the interesting, so what I found interesting in my research was to find out that this computer scientist, Ahmed El-Gamal, takes a similar view about art. In fact, he developed something called a CAN, a creative adversarial network, that drew upon the fact that art has to somehow belong to a canon of some kind. You have to produce something that fits within the canon at the same time is slightly different, but it can't be completely different. Otherwise, it would not be recognized as art. And that's very much my kind of view about how we should see architecture. But the real question to my mind is not so much whether AI could be creative, but whether AI can be maybe more creative than human beings. And here I'm in terms of the debate between Elon Musk and Jack Ma, where Jack Ma is telling us that it's impossible to create something that's smarter than human beings. I'm completely with Elon Musk. I mean, it depends, of course, how we describe, how we understand intelligence, but certainly there's a certain capacity in AI to come up with outcomes that are far beyond the range of what we ourselves as human beings can even conceive of. And the famous case, this was something that I think that Alan Turing had already recognized, where he's speculating, before even the term AI had been coined, speculating about the possibility about machines producing, in this case, sonnets. I do not think that you can even draw the line about sonnets. But then he makes this interesting comment, though the comparison is perhaps a little bit unfair because a sonnet written by a machine will be better appreciated by another machine. That's a very interesting kind of comment. And when we look at, for example, this, like the the case of AlphaGo, which is there was one particular move in this game, but in fact there are many moves, but one particular move that really caught the attention, and that is move 37 in game 2. It's the matches between AlphaGo, that is produced by DeepMind in London, and Llach, who was one of the leading Go players in the world from Korea. And there was this moment, and they were nervous. The people at DeepMind were nervous about glitches in the program, and there was a particular move that was made that at first appeared like a glitch in the program. In fact, according to some of the commentators, Llach started smiling. But then after a few seconds, that smile was drained from his face when everyone began to realize the sheer brilliance of this move. This is a move that had never been made, and there are more moves in Go than there are atoms in the universe, so the complexity of the game is astonishing. But this was a move that had never been made, and it was part of a series of what were called slack moves, which were produced by AlphaGo, that defied all the experts. No one had ever seen these moves before, and it wasn't until later that they understood the strategic brilliance of the move. So on the one hand, AlphaGo had showed us that it could produce moves. I don't know whether to call them creative, but they were certainly they were certainly beyond the range of what humans had produced. But then I was there's another way of looking at this particular question. That is to say, that is the way that is expressed by Llach. AlphaGo showed us that moves humans may have thought are creative were actually quite conventional. What he's suggesting is actually there's a range of moves beyond our imagination that are actually far superior to what we could do. But my point is this: we think it is creative. Whether it's creative or not is another question. In fact, Theodore Galanis, in one of our DDES sessions a few weeks ago, was saying, I don't think this move was creative at all. It was simply doing a search, and it came up with perhaps the best move. But it wasn't creative as such. It was just being thorough. It was going through a kind of process. My point is this: are we ascribing creativity to something? Are we thinking something is creative? In the sense we can't understand it if it is beyond our range. Therefore, are we just ascribing to it? Is creativity therefore in the eye of the beholder? Are we assuming that it is creative? I want to sort of comment here on Costa Tucides, who makes this comment that what AI establishes above all else is that every possible form is already out there, and it is simply a matter of searching for it. I mean, in a sense, to pick up on Sylvia's comments about research is about searching in many ways these ideas. This is maybe these days, maybe it's controversial, but the idea is that effectively everything's already there. It's simply a question of searching for it. And because we are limited as human beings and we have our own biases, we can't necessarily see all the range of possible options. And I think that from that point of view, there's a danger when we look at AI of beginning to sort of think that it is creative in the sense that we are creative or conscious. And this is GPT-3. I won't go into this now, but I will say that David Chalmers, probably the leading figure from philosophy talking about consciousness, kind of was fooled by this in some sense in thinking that somehow GPT-3 was a step towards AGI, towards artificial general intelligence, that is AI with consciousness. It might appear to have consciousness, but it doesn't. AI doesn't have consciousness. But I want to pick up here now on what the crucial point I want to make here, and that is to say, is creativity merely a myth? Are we simply ascribing something to be creative when it's not at all creative in the first place? Now, famously, Walter Benjamin, when he was describing the impact of photography on the art world, spoke about how the aura of the work of art began to wither in the age of mechanical reproduction or mechanical reproducibility. I'm not quite sure what he meant by aura, and of course Benjamin was an expert on translation, the problems of translation. But to my mind, aura is maybe tinged with some sense of mystique. It's almost a kind of magical term that makes something kind of special. And my point here is: are we going through a second phase in sense with the introduction of AI? Are we beginning to sort of recognize that maybe the aura, the auratic quality of creativity is itself being called into question by AI? And here I want to draw upon the famous argument that was made by John Searle, a philosopher from Berkeley, the Chinese room experiment, where he's commenting on, he's illustrating really the problem about AI. It might appear to have consciousness from the outside, and in this room here, there's an individual who's following instructions and producing a Chinese translation. which people on the outside think is astonishingly good, and they assume who's ever in that room is a fluent Chinese speaker, but of course the person in the room can't speak a word of Chinese. I want to take that example and turn it round and ask, isn't that the same issue with creativity? It's because we're not able to conceive or understand the processes in operation that are going on in this moment of generation, that we are ascribing them to being creative. In some ways, we are seeing it almost in erratic terms, that creativity has been this kind of magical moment. But it's simply because we don't understand what is going on there. So I want to just kind of quote briefly from my Millennium Culture book from 1999. And this is the kind of the issue about magic. Actually, there's no such thing as magic. When you see a magician, a conjurer playing a trick, it's not because that conjurer is actually doing magic. It's simply the conjurer is hiding, concealing the operations that are going on when he or she is pulling a rabbit out of a hat or whatever. And that's the problem about technology, about advanced technology, is that because we don't understand necessarily how it's operating, we can't see how it's operating, we tend to ascribe a certain sort of magical quality to it. We think that it's almost magical. So that has led me to this is one of the thoughts that's going to feed into my book about the death of the architect, in the sense that I think that it's one of the things it's calling into question in some ways is that creativity that we've thought so important. And maybe finish with a comment about the future of the architect. I mean, it seems to be very clear that already AI is putting at threat a profession already struggling. It's already having problems, and AI is going to be maybe the next nail in the coffin, as it were. People like Tom Main are saying, actually, it's quite a good thing that it's going to lead to a reduction in staff in an office. I'd rather have 12 people in my office than 80. If I have 12 people, then I can get to know them much better. So already 68 people are being made redundant by this kind of move. But I want to use the example of the self-driving car, which to my mind is an interesting example, because once you have a self-driving car, you don't need a driver. And the same goes for a computer that can generate architecture. Once you have a computer that can generate architecture, you don't need an architect. But I want to pick up on a particular comment that was made by Toby Walsh in a book called Machines That Think. Well, actually, AI doesn't think, so that's something wrong with the title. But he makes a prediction, which I think is really interesting, about the future of self-driving cars. And he says, what's going to happen is this. We are going to find that actually self-driving cars are actually quite convenient, and we're not going to bother driving so much. We're going to let them drive. Then after a while, we're going to lose our driving skills. And we're going to lose our driving skills. And then what's going to happen is the insurance premiums are going to go up. If we're going to drive ourselves, it's going to be too expensive to drive. And we're going to think, what the hell, let's not bother driving. Now, the point he makes, which is I think a beautiful comment, is that we won't even notice or care. Drivers will disappear and we won't notice or care. It's that could be the same with architects. And I just want to throw out another example. When I was a student, I used to go on holiday, I would go into a travel agent and I would buy a ticket. And then I'd go to a camera shop. I would buy a film. And then I'd come back from my holiday. I would take the film to be processed, and so on and so on. There are almost no travel agents anymore. There are certainly very few camera shops because iPhones have got cameras and so on. And you certainly don't get your film developed these days. You take it on the camera. So the idea that somehow these institutions that I was brought up with, travel agents and camera shops and developers and so on, were going to be there forever is I think, sort of wrong. So I wanted to then wrap this up by simply sort of saying that the title is the death of the architect, the demise of the architectural profession in the age of AI. It's not just AI, but AI is going to be, in some senses, to my mind, is kind of a serious impact on the world of architecture, to the point that many of our students will won't have to find employment there. My prediction is that by the end of the decade, by 2030, machines will be able to generate complete designs. Already, we're finding from XCool that forget about BIM, forget all these things. You can bypass these, but with certain deep learning AI processes, the ABC model they put forward. And my prediction is Moore's law with acceleration is that by the end of the decade, we'll be in a situation whereby we can already generate buildings completely through AI. So. So the architect, in many ways, was conceived by Alberti in 1450. Already, that model is being eroded in some sort of way. And my prediction is therefore that by 2030, 2030, that will be the end of the architect as we know it. So RIP, the architect. And once we reach that stage, it's game over. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. So I don't have too much time. There's not much time. Okay, thank you for the presentation. It was incredible and really controversial, and there's a lot of things to talk about it. But let's just move on to our next speaker. The next speaker is Enrique Walker. He is an architect. He has taught at the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation since 2003. He's also directed the Master of Science program in Advanced Architectural Design until 2018. And in addition, he has taught at MIT, Princeton University, Tokyo Institute of Technology, and the Universidad de Chile. His publication includes several books, like the recent The Ordinary Recording, which is a beautiful book. So thank you, Enrique, to have you here, and time is yours.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Marina, thank you very much as well, Marina and Neil, for the invitation to take part in this event. I must also say that I was unsure how to tackle the panel in the first place, and I'm still a bit unsure. So I've decided to do it sort of obliquely, let's say at best obliquely, at worst doggedly, to sort of go back rather than forward, and read a dead text I wrote some 16 years ago. Very, very brief, a sort of list or an inventory, and a text that I would use to basically present my earlier studios at Columbia in the 2004, 2005. So I'll share the screen with you. Also, I'll follow Sylvia's redefinition of the format and retitle my lecture on the spot lecture, that presentation, as a swerve. That would be the new title. I loved Sylvia's move. I follow it. And I would say that basically this is a very short text that as I said, I will take it as a sort of dead text, or at best a found object. I basically made a list to introduce my earlier studios, which were about self-imposed constraints. It was about reasserting the use of constraints in design. And I produced this list as a way of situating the problem within a certain architecture culture, primarily by borrowing from literature and film practices, or I would rather say to sort of try to swerve architecture culture by, since architecture culture has a long-standing tradition of dealing with constraints, but I would basically address it in a slightly different way to put emphasis on those constraints which were voluntary and therefore arbitrary. And the point of this list was rather to very much in the lineage of the way in which certain architects like the Smithsons did in Palace of Life and Art, or Archigram did in The Living City, or Toyo Ito did in Simulation within Visions of Japan, where you would basically gather stuff that was not of your own making as a way of simply delineating a sensibility, which in turn would allow you to sort of enter a question of architecture culture and to situate your project, but also yourself. So what I plan to do is simply to read the text, and of course, since it's much later, I will probably annotate it as well. So hopefully, I think it, at worst, it would be irrelevant today. At best, it would be a sort of Duchampian urinal, and it could have some value. Okay, so Raymond Roussel decided to write certain of his books by using two homonymous or almost homophonic sentences as the beginning and end of his stories. Impressions of Africa. Samuel Beckett decided to write his in a language other than his own, Waiting for Godot. Thomas Bernhard decided to write some of his own in one paragraph, Extinction. Jerzy Andrzejewski decided to write a novel in one sentence, Gates of Paradise. Georges Perec decided to write a novel without the use of a certain letter, A Void. Michel Butor decided to write a novel in the second person, A Change of Heart. Italo Calvino decided to write a novel with 10 beginnings, if on a winter's night a traveler. Raymond Queneau decided to write a set of 10 sonnets whose corresponding lines could be replaced with one another. 100,000 billion poems. Llach decided to write a collection of poems corresponding to the pieces of a game of Go, E. Jacques Jouet decided to write poems corresponding to the stops of his metro journeys, metro poems. Marcel Benabou decided to write a book by giving an account of his impossibility to write one. Why have I not written any of my books? Gilbert Sorrentino decided to write a novel by only resorting to questions. Gold Fools. Harry Matthews decided to write a novel by, alas, he declined to reveal his decision. Cigarettes. Sui Pen decided to write a book as a labyrinth. The Garden of Forking Paths, as told by Jorge Luis Borges. Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau decided to make a silent film without resorting to intertitles. The Last Laugh. Chris Marker decided to make a film by only resorting to stills. La Jetée. Alfred Hitchcock decided to make a film in a seemingly continuous take. Rope. Alexander Sokurov decided to make a film in a single shot. A Russian Ark. Chantal Akerman decided to make a film by shadowing the protagonist. Jean Dillman. Dziga Vertov decided to make a film by using the city as the protagonist. Man with a movie camera. Luis Buñuel decided to make a film by constantly changing the protagonist, the Phantom of Liberty. Alain Resnais decided to make a film which would trace all the possible forkings of a story. Smoking, no smoking. Michelangelo Antonioni decided to make a film whose story would only be unleashed in the very last minutes. La Notte. Nestor Almendros decided to accept Terrence Malick's decision to shoot a film almost entirely during the magic hour after sunset. Days of Heaven. Jürgen Leth decided to accept Lars von Trier's obstructions to remake one of his films, The Five Obstructions. Stanley Kubrick decided to light a candlelight scene in one of his films by only using candles, Barry Lyndon. Werner Herzog decided to make some of his films by documenting real actions, Fitzcarraldo. Jean-Luc Godard decided to make some of his own with a girl and a gun, Breathless. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Enrique. That was amazing, as always. It's a really pleasure to hear your bad text. So we need to move on, and then we have a lot of questions there and controversy around the chat. But let's move on to our next speaker. He's Ciro Najle. It's an honor to have you here, Ciro. He's an architect from the Universidad of Buenos Aires and Master of Advanced Architectural Design for Columbia University. He's currently the Dean of the Escuela de Arquitectura y Estudios Urbanos at the Universidad Torcuato de Itela in Buenos Aires. Ciro has taught at the Harvard GSD, the Architectural Association, Cornell, Columbia, the Llach. His publication include the beautiful book, The Generic Sublime, among others, and he's also the director of the General Design Bureau. His research practice engaged the convergence of digital culture, ecological thinking, and complexity theory in architecture at the edge of globalization. So the space and time is yours, Ciro. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Marina, for the invitation, and everyone. I'm very happy and challenged to be here among all these people. So I'm going to read a piece I wrote for the purpose of this conversation, for this discussion, and perhaps it serves for that. It's true, and what a veiled oxymoron it is to say it's true. The production of architecture culture appears to have reached an extraordinary state of loss, unprecedented at this level at least, where any discourse has become an evident form of fiction, where no truth is veritable, where any fact is fake, where no argument sustains, and where no position is solid. But it is also true, this time in the form of a simple acknowledgement, that this state of things has already accompanied us for a long time, and that one can trace archetypal precedents of the death of truth to various radically skeptical and equally provocative anticipations, from the death of God to the death of the author, or more recently to the end of ideology. And still, here we are, right now, nurturing culture with vehemence, paradoxically by navigating the waters of its alleged death. Paradoxical as well seems the fact that the more we avoid confronting this evidence, the more lethargic culture becomes, and that the more daringly we call for its death, and the more actively we engage with a wide array of its consequences, the livelier it gets. This paradox is being, in any case, more often than not, omitted both by the blind obsessiveness of the fundamentalists and by the insolent negligence of the celebrators. The reason being that both equally disregard the fact that architecture neither delineates and defines the truth that culture is grounded upon, nor it merely entertains it, but rather produces it. My position, therefore, in this context, is at its basis to fully embrace it, and yet to flip the radical skepticism involving the operation upside down, turning the will to death, and not the state of death itself, into a force, and engaging the vitality of its cold-bloodedness to supersede, through that very force, the terrifyingly paralyzing scenario of the loss of value that it appears to bring about. In this context, I would like to propose that the idea itself of a death of architecture, culture, must be broken down into the concrete processes that take part into it. On the one hand, the wild and most extreme fragmentation of architectural materials since postmodernity. Second, the open-ended diversification of the idea of organization. Third, the increasing virtuality of the material medium. Fourth, the voracious rapidity of consumption. Fifth, the interchangeability of anything with anything. And finally, the consequent devastation of meaning on which argumentative truth can be grounded. Regarding the fragmentation of materials, it seems that both the celebration of the abstract turning of materials into bits and the pseudo-historically loaded compensation of their loss of content with figures are equally ephemeral and devoid of cultural strength, as they both erode inertia without obtaining or constructing any other enduring form of force. Architecture appears to have lost its gravitas. Regarding the diversification of organizations, the promise of transversal navigation and enrichment, together with the consequent series of extravagant approaches to organization, has come to mean that anything can be architecture, and that assemblies, no matter how complex, have become secondary to materials, decorative accessories, and therefore poorer. Architecture appears to have lost its status. Regarding the virtuality of a medium, the force and the freedom that the virtual has brought and indelibly drilled at the very core of the representational tradition of architecture, as its tendencies consolidated and crystallized as givens, and its technical resources of simulation, modeling, automation, and programming have expanded, has become sheer volatility. Architecture appears to have lost its ground. Regarding the rapidity of consumption, the increasing overexposure and availability of objects and their doing and their thinking has turned the production of trends and ideas, that is to say, of architecture research, into the production of services and resources, to the point that opportunities come before drives have even started to be visible, thus masking them. Architecture appears to have lost the reality of its force. Regarding the interchangeability of things, architectural things, these being materials, elements, objects, organizations, procedures, ideas, trends, movements, or even positions, the smooth and previously promising capability to navigate across sources enabled by media, even together with its allegedly critical misuse, has brought about a structural loss of weight. Architecture appears to have lost its value. Finally, regarding the devastation of meaning, the progressive weightlessness of things has built a negative feedback loop with their cultural insipidness, configuring a flimsy, meaningless scenario where thought melts down into comment, conversation, or even debate, and praxis raises up with the apparent solidity of a fact at a rate proportional to their broadcasting. Architecture appears to have lost its sense. This presumably discouraging scenario However, and this is my point today, has been among us at previous times and in different forms, and is like at each of those times, but now in a wilder, deeper version, extremely promising. Because each of its erosions, problems, dilutions, drawbacks, dilemmas, and weaknesses is actually a newly structural form of freedom. And we should not focus in the losses they involve, nor in criticizing the reasons, but in constituting a new kind of architectural body out of them. This new disciplinary body is, by definition, a form of cultural constructivism, which, by the way, could be seen as a nice definition of what architecture might have always aspired to be. Such cultural constructivism not only accepts the inevitable erosion of materials that surround us and the losses it involves, but precisely uses that erosion to learn how to constitute materials in abstract terms, from the one to the many and from the many to the one, by means of the internal integration of their attributes and the configuration of abstract, yet highly concrete constraints, thus configuring unprecedented free forms of cultural inertia and tendency. It simultaneously engages organizations, not merely in view to provide order, that is, inherited forms of order absorbed and naturalized to otherwise disparate domains, but rather, this cultural constructivism foresees that the true capability of organizations lies in the strength and endurance of their internal consistency, rather than in their efficacy to ends, transient by definition, and therefore constitutes organizations in parallel to the models of organization that lie behind them, in a dual interactive process between the general and the singular. The virtual is, in this context, the perfect medium to enable the fluidity of such interaction. And yet this unbounded fluidity is, as said, constantly nurtured by restrictions. And how would the virtual be not simply an idealization if it were not loaded with restrictions, rather than unstably floating in the rather obsolete limbo of indeterminacy? The conception of this fluid medium is thus as much facilitated as it is problematized, enabling but resisting its absorption by conventional practice, rendering transparent while deeply obscuring its objects, exhibiting its procedures as methodologies while rendering them intrinsically inscrutable. The value of this form of architecture lies then not only in its efficacy nor in its artistry, but in the efficacy of its artistry and in the artistry of its efficacy, raising the figure of the architect above its classical and or its modern status, neither an autonomous author nor a heteronymous instrument. Finally, such notion of authorship involves that architecture, precisely by means of its losses, is challenged to produce its own conditions of existence, nurturing them through the abstraction of factual scenarios and building those abstractions up into self-standing models out of them. This form of architecture, which I today provisionally call over-architecture, although I have previously named it shitshow architecture, literally operates as an apparent fake form that precisely by means of its bogus condition becomes the new form of the real, incarnating the contemporary paradox and turning it into a program. Over-architecture is then the seriously playful condition that architecture claims for through the cold-blooded synthesis of the infinitely minute, inert, ahistorical, weightless, and radically emptied out fragments that surround us at the edge of implosion of culture. A new form of discipline, both transdisciplinary and autonomous, and emotionally heroic, simultaneously passionate and indifferent. Thank you.
Thank you, Ciro. That was amazing. So great. And there is also your previous presentation about sheet architecture. So I encourage everyone who didn't watch it yet that look at our YouTube channel, because it's available for everyone. So thank you, Ciro. And now we have to move on to our last speaker today, Sanford Quinter is a New York-based writer on architectural theories and co-founder of the influential Sun Books publishers. Sanford currently serves as professor at Pratt Institute. He formerly served as associate professor at Rice University, Houston, Texas, and also MIT, Columbia University, Cornell, GSD. Having received a doctorate in comparative literature from Columbia University, Sanford lectured at Harvard University, Angewandte, Berlage Institute, Architectural Association, and many other institutions. And over the last 20 years, his publications have pioneered new ideas in art, architecture, science, and the humanity. He has written widely on philosophical issues related to design, architecture, and urbanism. He was involved in a series of comprehensive publications in any magazine. I don't have anything much to say, Sanford. It's a pleasure to have you here. And as the Rolling Stones said, time is on your side this time. So, Sanford, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesus. Wow. So listen, guys, man, I feel very stimulated. Let me say that right off the bat. That's a way of apologizing for what is probably going to come out of my mouth, because I don't exactly know what is going to come out. Though I'd like to say a few things by way of beginning. First off, Sylvia privately texted me early on, and she asked me if I had any idea what this was about. And I said, I absolutely did not. And I didn't really understand what death of culture might be, really, where did that even come from, especially in what I know about this particular context, which, you know, digital and future and so on. Where was I going with that? I thought Marina's initial text was really incredibly interesting and very provocative. Had that been circulated to us, I think we would have perhaps had, I don't know what to say, as rich for sure, but perhaps a more focused, shall we say, set of responses. It was really good, and I wish I had had it earlier. Sylvia then asked me, why do we even do these kinds of things? And I had no problem in responding. It's because I always find them, I told her that because I get agitated. I learn an amazing amount, and because it agitates me. So I would like to say I feel very agitated right now. So I organized a couple of ideas in response. I would have to say, though, that, you know, I found the presentations fantastic. And in their variety, it went off in so many directions that I believe actually the hypothesis of culture being dead is demonstrably dismissed right here as dead on arrival. If I can say that death is dead on arrival, there is no death of culture. And it strikes me as I begin winding up to what I knew I was going to end my intervention with, I would say that that is, has very much to do with how we think about these problems. And I would like to say the problems of human action, creativity, the so-called intelligence that is being developed today, shall we say, largely outside of traditional human cultural spheres, as if such a thing can exist outside of that context. And the question ultimately about culture is whether or not human culture is dead. And I would have to say I agree with many of the side comments that many made, suggesting that that was a failure, let's say, a failure of rigor and a failure of thought. So a few things I wanted to say is this: is in the few minutes I had before the session started after waking up this morning, instead of trying to sketch down some ideas of what I would present, I started reading the article that came out this morning in the New York Times Magazine. I don't know if any of you had opportunity yet to read this, but I know you are all going to read it. It's an article on Clearview, the piece of software that is in such legal, well, let's say this controversial piece of software that is AI software, which is scraping, to use the term, which I like. I like the vulgarity and the ugliness of that term, scraping the internet for images of people. But anyway, I suggest you all read it for a couple of reasons. Number one, obviously you're all going to be interested in it, so you are going to read it anyway. What struck me about it is the journalism is very, very good, but so many of the topics that get brought up, legal and otherwise, could actually be completely seen as philosophical problems that are largely being unaddressed in the field of technological development, and in the field that Neil is, in a certain sense, continually folding into this, which is the problem and the destiny of what we call consciousness, and what the human contribution and participation, shall we say, in that phenomenon actually is. I share that interest with him, but I do not share many of the directions in which he personally has begun to commit to it. And I see the deformation in Neil's approach to the topic as having to do with the horrific pressure of publishing deadlines, and in a certain sense, the need to scrape, if you like, the cultural scene for, let's just say, for arguments that fit a bias. And the confirmation of a bias, in a certain sense, is truly an enemy of philosophical thought. So in a certain sense, I also know why Neil invites a lot of us to these kinds of things, and it is as if it would prevent that kind of thing. I know that's why I'm here. When I said agitation, it's in a certain sense always to be confronted with aspects of one's bias. And I think there are two things that are important for a theorist, for a writer, for an intellectual, and that is to refine one's biases and to declare them as positions. That's to say, as a specifically let's say, human cognitive product that really will never be, by very virtue of the fact that the human is a finite entity, whereas the machinic universe and its products are not. In other words, they're not mortal. And it is mortality itself which connects us, shall we say, to what is the genius of this problem that we're all thinking about, or many of us were, which is creativity. Now, as I move on, I realize it's I don't have much time now because I waste it in this kind of, unrigorous reflection. But I want to say that, in listening to Daniel, for example, I thought I was surprised in a certain way, not because I know him, I'm not surprised by him bringing it up, but I think it takes courage, for example, for a researcher in his field to begin any kind of ultimate presentation by talking about life. And that is and also to talk about the AI's toxic, if you like, relationship to that, when he talks about emptying life from our world, et cetera, his interest in enlivening, and so on and so forth. So look, I would like to say that one of the topics, I put anything that I wanted to talk about in red in my notes. I have 2 pages of notes, but there are 2 things I feel like I would like to say also, in many ways, as a way of also acknowledging Enrique's presentation, because in my first thoughts about what needed to be said, but also how I could contribute to a conversation about this, I knew that AI would become at least an epicenter for the conversation today, even though it was declared to be about culture. it struck me is that what is it about AI that is so filthy, so absolutely, so rapacious, so, what can I say, so toxic, because it's not been identified. Now, I don't want to go down the path, or shall I say, the rabbit hole that I went down in the 90s as a critic, shall we say, of technological development, but it's nonetheless, it's a reflex I have, also even as a Canadian. And it occurs to me that some of the requirements any philosopher will need to do today is to introduce frameworks that will trouble, if you like, the cheerleaders, if you like, of the field, et cetera, and how the deformation in how we even understand culture is already taking place. And I wanted to just say that one of the first thoughts that came to me this morning as I was reading the story in the New York Times about Clearview is the idea, and it was invoked by a few speakers already today, I'm just going to say it in a different way. What is ugly, shall we say, about AI is the way in which it is disturbing the metabolic rate of the processing and the generation of information. In other words, it has now exceeded by any possible measure the metabolic rates, that's to say the rate at which information, which Bateson described as a difference, if you like, that makes a difference. That's to say the differences that are generated by our world and by our universe, the rate at which these essentially are able to be gathered and concentrated. There is something there that is horrific and that needs to be understood. So those who have called for a slowing down, and I don't mean a slowing down the train of culture or of the world. I'm talking for those who have retrained attention on the information that is available, if you like, by there is a word, I can't get it right now, but the slowing down, the ralenti, the French would say, of the unfolding, the algorithmic unfolding, shall we say, of being, of existence. I think that these things are very important. I guess by way of getting to my end, I wanted to say, this is a note that I have under the Leach talk. He was going on at a certain point discussing search. I can't remember exactly right now what he was saying regarding search. And I felt it was also important at least to begin to insert a wedge into the more facile assimilation of old thoughts and concepts, those things that come from our history, even our extended history outside of the European and Western tradition. But that's to say things that were produced by social encephalized mammals like humans versus those things that are being extracted from other continua, shall we say, other clouds of information. There is a difference, to get to the point, between searching for something when one has an idea, when one actually plugs in a request into a search, and this is implicit virtually in all AI, versus the simple state of being open to discovery. In a certain sense, there is a difference between opening one's senses and actually narrowing, bounding them, and trying to extend them deeper, if you like, into, shall we say, the fabric of existence. They both yield information, but any researcher who uses the word information today without a mountain of qualifications is no valid researcher at all. It isn't just information anymore. There are thousands of categories and qualities of information, and if we need to insist on anything, it would be that. So I am now going to put my my money onto the attitude, shall we say, the cognitive posture, the deployment, shall we say, of the evolved nervous system. That's to say, the nervous system of the living universe, and what capacities and what hopes we ought to invest. We ought to recognize and invest in it. Neil was looking in many ways, maybe it's necessary for one of the chapters in his book, to naturalize mere repetition and in certain sense to demystify the idea of novelty, specificity, uniqueness, true invention, et cetera, et cetera. So by way of maybe saying something, you know, Neil, and I as well, are interested in this problem of consciousness because it is emerging absolutely necessarily as AI proponents are encountering obstacles, problems, but also realizing their theoretical foundations are piss poor, or the naivety of theoretical understanding that they bring to the table is starting to become a liability, extremely noticeable even to them. But the simple recourse to the so-called philosophers of consciousness, in my opinion, is not doing its job. Now, I'm going to suggest that there's a single idea here that I'm going to try and underline as I step out of my intervention. I just don't know how to do it because I've been involved in some research in the relationship between consciousness and music for 4 or 5 years, but I haven't really come out of the closet on it yet. And I suppose what I'm hesitating is whether I do so today. But let me do it because I discovered some things over time, and I'm trying to find a way of organizing them for the use of others. The first thing I would like to say is the one thing we know from our study of the recent developments in neurobiology, neuroscience, is the following. The brain, the human brain, but probably to a certain degree also non-human brains. But the first thing I would like to say is the human brain is unlike any other brain in the living world for a variety of reasons. I won't go into them now, but the most important one is that the human brain, most of the important and interesting capacities of the human brain were developed outside of the womb and therefore were responses to the actual universe, the actual structure, the spatial temporal structure of the world. And that's a very important problem because our brain, in a certain sense, more than any other species, actually is connected to the world. But nonetheless, it's also true about all brains, all wet computational devices, is that like sharks, you know, the brain cannot be idle. A brain dies with idleness if it doesn't have stimulus, a continual supply of stimulus running through it. In other words, if the brain is not receiving a continual supply of information, or shall we say of differences that it must metabolize, it will simply begin to die. All of its connections will wither and so on and so forth. What this, however, has done, it has created a capacity in the brain when external stimulus is not forthcoming, it must generate that stimulus itself. In other words, motion is a condition of possibility of the survival and especially the health and the thriving of a computational system such as is found in the wet nervous system. Without it, so the fact of the matter is, it is also capable of generating this difference internally. Now, the way I wanted to connect this was the fact that the world itself, the question of the aura, the question of the uniqueness of things, the question whether we should recognize it or throw it out into the garbage can, as in a way Neil's book, I would say far more than Neil, is wanting to be able to say. That is never going to happen, and that is why those guys like Watanabe and others, they somehow know this, and even frankly, what's his name, Elon Musk, he knows it as well. In a sense, they agreed, those two guys, more than they disagreed. I want to talk about something which I may be embarrassed to talk about. So the first thing I may say this is right now, is my time up? Is my 10 minutes has got to be up?
As I told you, Sanford, the time is on your side. You can take more time if you want.
Okay, well, I'll try to be very, very brief here, and I will say this. So, can we experience the impetus of the piece of matter, of worldly matter, which metabolizes the rest of worldly matter? In other words, can we experience these processes in our brain? Can we make sense of them? And in fact, can we use these intuitions to better understand, if you like, the way we shape our universe, the way we shape what can be called stimulus, the stimulus that architecture and all design is in the business, if you like, of organizing and implanting in the world. So one of the experiments I am currently personally embarked in, and I confess that it's one that's going on, it went on last night, is I take, administered by a physician in a relatively controlled setting, a relatively low dose of intramuscular ketamine, and I listen to a variety of different musics as the action of the medicine erodes entirely the boundaries that were created inside of one, and in other words, that produce one's self, in the sense that one is no longer has recourse to the filters through which the sense data of the world is almost in a Kantian sense is pre-shaped before it is experienced. And when that happens, the only real sensory input is the motion that is represented by music. Now, what happens in the ketamine experience is that the brain is left more or less stripped of everything but its natural, productive, creative, necessary motion. So what it is, it's an algorithm set into wild unfolding. However, it must grasp onto something. The brain must shape something. That is why there is always a requirement for stimulus. But it is unlike dreaming in the sense that in a dream state, one has immediate access to shaped memories and shaped feelings and shaped experiences. In the ketamine state, there's an amazing erasure, shall we say, of everything that is personal. So one enters into a fully transpersonal experience of space and time, but one is guided by the constraint system of the specific piece of music that one is listening to, which then becomes the full universe, the full sensory experience. What happens then is the brain produces a series of astonishing images and shapes, motions, architectures, experiences of geological and sometimes cosmological, but they're always remarkably not mine or not yours, but also ours. Now, there are so many complexities to this particular thing, but what they are, I would argue, is an experience of pure consciousness without, if you like, the contribution of organized, what we could call today cultural, because we have to say our entire physical universe is a product of of cultural organization, or shall we say, of organized intelligence. The question now, of course, is, are we thinking about intelligence properly? The only thing I want to say here is that these experiences like I just presented today are clear evidence, at least to me, that to maintain the opposition between self and other, between interior and exterior, is a completely false one. And that this bias, Cartesian, or you could say otherwise, continues to exist today and continues to poison the way we think about these questions. And I would say that if architecture, or shall we say design, or shall we say even the technocrats in this, the technological specialists in this field, who are now engaging with problems of consciousness, but who, for example, are completely predisposed to see their practices as more linked, shall we say, to music, or to the flow and infinite generation, the spontaneous generation of singularity, which is both the nature, of the natural world, the nature of time, but also the nature of our biology. I think that we're not on the right page. That's where I'll leave off.
Thank you, Sam, for that. That was amazing. And there is like a lot of things around the topic of the event, which is deeply controversial in several ways. Not only because of nobody wants to believe that, or nobody wants to believe, no, but nobody wants to think that the culture can be dead, because it's part of what we are in all our decisions. And also that you mentioned about biases in the last part of your presentation. It's like what I was trying, at least like a kind of ironic strategy, is what to try to mention that kind of concept that we are so used to, or we listen so often, but finally become absolutely obsolete. And that's what I was trying to make a kind of operation to try to say that this kind of binary thinking, or to try to think in this binary way, is what in a way was part of our culture, but in ways was a narrow perspective to determine our culture. But that's my just to explain a little bit more about my introduction, and just to say that I didn't want to send it before to you, because I was thinking that also a surprise in terms of this motion that you mentioned, no? In terms of intuition, and how do you react to something. It's like a kind of it's like a kind of strategy to survive in a way. And I believe that surprise is like something always dynamic in a conversation, or it can like yes, include like in a way something unexpected. And there is also the topic of the event. It's like, I don't know how many people want to talk about the death of the culture as a topic, the death of culture as a topic. I believe nobody wants to talk about it. Like the same that the provocation of Neil, nobody wants to talk about the death of the architect. No? Nobody wants to talk about it. It's like something so provocative in terms of it make you think a lot of things, or rethink about a lot of preconceptions that we have, and also about our own existence. Because in a way, when you think that the culture is dead, well, you say, okay, there is not more human, so that means that culture, no, human culture in that case, as you said, Sanford, which is dead. But anyway, just to say a few comments about all the speakers. It's like we have like absolutely different perspective. And once it could say like, okay, this is like, but there is like some links between the presentation, but also big differences. And I believe that that's what make this kind of event so interesting, in terms of, as Neil said, the event is historical itself. Just to have you here thinking even about how ridiculous could be talk about the death of culture. It's a historical itself. And I want to make some questions about to open to the conversation, because you between Neil and Sylvia, there was like some exchange during the presentations, but also between you, Sanford, and Neil in terms of what you presented, and some questions about his presentation. So I want to open the discussion to all of you with this kind of question about that. I mean, how do you think that is like these kind of topics, the uncomfortable topics, in terms of with all the bias that we have, do you think that these kind of things, it's important to be discussed, or it has to be determined by certain models of discussion, or what do you think that all this lineup, I mean, all of you think that this kind of conversation driving is just to the ridiculous, the absolutely ridiculous, or the productive ridiculous of the event? So maybe that's an open question to all of you. I don't know if someone wants to pick up on this.
I'm just going to maybe change the topic a little bit to something perhaps a little bit more concrete, and just preface it by saying that I don't think it's quite correct, Marina, to convert people who are disagreeing with the proposition to convert disagreement into resistance. That there is just a difference there. So we might resist the idea that the architect is dead, but we might also say we've heard his death proclaimed so many times that it's a little bit hard to arise to this occasion again. There's that kind of death of the architect fatigue, perhaps, which might be another topic. But Enrique, can I just ask you some really dumb questions, and they're very dumb in the sense that I just really want to focus on what you presented, the words you used, the fact that you reread this thing, that that you turned something that had been some kind of speculative statement into a historical document. This is what I witnessed. So I would just be sort of describing what I saw, and I'm interested in this as a demonstration of something that I just happen to be interested in: the conversion of all things into documents, the idea that you present the document as such so that it poses with the quality, I might borrow the word aura, of the evidentiary. This is what I understood you to be doing, or this is what made it fascinating for me to think about what you're doing. So then, in the age of multiple screens and Google and so forth, I was sitting there watching all of your comments, and becoming, I confess, this is my own weakness, but becoming something like an evidence cop. And I was trying to think, what are the rules that he's applying? What's the method? And I was quite disturbed that I couldn't find, I didn't understand the order. Like at first it seemed, chronological, then not chronological, so then I started doing data compilations and thinking, too many men, too many men, too many men. Oh, there's a woman. He realized it. We got to, film director. I'm just saying, this is in the context of today's reception of information, this kind of what had begun as a slightly surreal, robe gris attention to detail is converted into various kinds of data sets. And then the entire gambit is essentially reducible to the quality of those data sets. I'm just saying today, I think that's the way our work is received, or work quote, culture is received. And we have these categories. There have to be some of these, there have to be some of these, et cetera. So I was waiting for your editorial comments and was assuming that you might add some other, that you would diversify this list today if you were going to write it for tomorrow's studio brief, and wondered whether you would rewrite it, and in what way would you rewrite it?
I think you're reading my intention. That was exactly what I thought I could do by rereading it. I don't think I would do something of the same kind today. I mean, let's say there are two questions and then a comment regarding the suspicion of what I was doing. One is that I think, yeah, I wrote it with the emphasis on the word decision. And this goes back to what Daniel suggested, because it was a time when studio culture was ruling out decision-making and judgment. So this was completely exactly what sort of Daniel's conceptual upgrade of algorithmic design. That was one. Secondly, there was an insistence on decision meant somebody in relation to the making of a film or a piece of writing, and that implied, in addition, pleasure, which I think connects to what I would basically respond to Neil's comment, that basically there's people who are doing things, and that implies whether, let's say, whether storytelling needs writers or not, people need storytelling, and that is the point, because they derive pleasure from it. And I think that would be applicable also to the sort of claim of the death of the architect. Architects derive pleasure from designing. So whether we can save architecture from humans or not, I don't think that would be the point. The point would be that there's people who need to relate to the world by making things. That was the second one. Now, whether I would do it today in a different way, this was a number of things I gathered all through the 90s when I was a student, of things that I was interested in, of people who were working under constraints. So there's, of course, cultural biases. Very few English, a lot of French, naturally. Thus, because of cultural biases. So I don't think I would do today a sort of a corrected version for today mentality, because it's I was not thinking through those terms. Also, it would be sort of gathering people who work in this manner is already sort of tough. I basically had to stretch it with the filmmakers to stuff which was really not really under constraints. Stuff that had the sensibility. Ziga Vertov shouldn't be there. Godard shouldn't be there, and a few others. Werner Herzog on the edge. So this was simply to try and nourish a sensibility through which I could work in my own studio, and through which I could basically enter the question of design. Now, the other question, whether it's about the evidentiary, I want to ask you, Sylvia, because I really like your piece as a provocation of our contemporary relation to academia. I'm completely with you as a sort of diagnosis of what's going on. I feel on the opposite side to what's going on. So I would not, even though I may fit generationally, I would not feel part of the sort of a data-driven world. In fact, this is anything but data. These are marginal people working on sort of difficult problems, of solving problems that they imposed on themselves that they actually didn't need, which is instigated by, on the one hand, pleasure of solving the equation, and secondly, potentially opening up another way of conceiving a film or conceiving a book. But I'm interested in what you opened up, because I think the sort of next step in, if you had a longer talk probably, would have been to pose the question as to how, and I wouldn't say necessarily historians, but intellectuals in academia engage design or questions of speculations in architecture. I imagine that was the next the sort of punch that would go after, and I would have liked to hear more about it, but also to sort of second it. I would completely be positioned on that space. So I would not see what I presented as a sort of evidence of the evidentiary and the sort of data-driven world. Not at all.
Except just to follow up on this, when you say, well, there were a lot of French and there were the biases of the time. I mean, on the one hand, this is where except for these things, whether we consider them minor or fundamentally structuring conditions, this is one of the things I think that we have to grapple with. But I guess when I said evidentiary in the manner of presentation, what I was referring to was not only this conversion of a once, to borrow Marina's vocabulary, the conversion of what was once a kind of living proposition into a historical document, but also in the language that you use within the document, it was very bureaucratic, prosaic, descriptive, not a single adjective, every sentence reduced to the efficiency of communication logic of an office memorandum. And it's because of that logic that I would say that it plays with the evidentiary paradigm, because it has eliminated what is apparently, quote, the cultural techniques of rhetoric, of excess, of description, of affect, etc., to become this. I mean, of course, I'm deliberately ignoring the surrealism, of the effect overall. But there is this, I was extremely taken by this super retrenchment into this modern rhetorical mode that has the memorandum logic that has been described as a form of rhetoric that has forgotten that it was once rhetorical and learned.
No, but that is quite deliberate. So I agree. It basically has two, let's say, technically it has two strands. One is a sort of a very French approach to description, which is Perec or even Roussel. I mean, Rodríguez talking about Roussel say he had nothing to say and he said it badly. That's one. And it was actually also sort of Chantal Ackerman, deadpan looking at some action with basically almost like removing adjectives from filmmaking. But on the other, there's also the sort of Beckett approach that you write in a different language in order to streamline it rather than to mimic the other language. I completely agree with those were deliberate. But I wouldn't call it memorandum, but sort of deliberately boring, which is why I read it, because in fact it implies that you challenge. Also, if it's on culture, let's see whether people are willing to take it. Meaning the audience.
Yeah, that's great. I believe that there is like some, I mean, under the logics of all what we presented today, it's almost impossible not to notice everyone biases in the way they present. And even in my text, is presented absolutely irony in all the words and things, just to stimulate a kind of exchange. And I believe that there is also a strategy in terms of when you take something like a method of writing, then when you take a vocabulary from someone else, and you even the quote strategy, when you manipulate the quote to make somebody say something in the context of your text, is absolutely changed the original meaning sometimes of what the author was saying. But anyway, I just want to give to Neil the opportunity to say something about this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marina. This is actually a great discussion. Let me just I want to respond to Sanford. First of all, I'd say it's great that I managed to agitate you. I think that's fantastic, right? I mean, I remember reading Socrates once describing himself a bit like being an insect. That was kind of the role of the insect was to disturb the state in some way by biting it or something, whatever, and to provoke a discussion. And I think what I want to say is, in a sense, is that in some ways I'm very much on your side, and maybe that's not so clear. It's not so clear because sometimes, well, first of all, maybe when I was presenting my stuff, I was really asking a question. To my mind, theory is about asking questions, So my question was simply is creativity for human beings simply the myth of creativity? So it was more a question as such. But I want to kind of stress the fact that I'm very much a believer in the kind of notion of the dialectic. I think that's how the brain operates in many ways, like a hydraulic mechanism. And sometimes when you're coming from one position, you're making an argument which might seem to be kind of monologic in some way, but actually it's meant to be dialectical in some ways. And the problem about making a polemic, and I really wanted to raise a polemical point, is that you, in some ways, it is undialectical. You, in order to make that point, you leave out the other side of the coin, and that's important because that's something that's being left out. And so I want to just stress that there is a background behind all this to which I'm responding in some way that maybe is a little mysterious in some senses. But I want to pick up on a kind of question, maybe or a comment that Ciro made years ago, and I really liked Ciro's way of thinking, and that's to say, he was running studios in the AA that were bringing on board. Hanif Kara was there as an engineer, and I was kind of intrigued by why Ciro was bringing in Hanif Kara, and I mistook his position in some ways. I mistook his position as being an interest in structural engineering. And actually what he said to me was really interesting. He said, actually, I'm not interested in structural engineering at all. I want to overcome it. I want to get beyond it. But in some ways, it becomes something, a foil against which I can operate. And that, to my mind, was an incredibly kind of rich comment, which I really, in some ways, I would subscribe to in many ways. I would just say, from my particular background, and maybe I think that from the position of kind of culture, it's a bit like I wouldn't say a pendulum so much, but it has this hydraulic mechanism, and you're responding in some ways to a particular kind of context. And I was taught at the University of Cambridge by Dalibor Vasley in a way. Someone I kind of really critique in many ways, but he was responding to it, the kind of scientific kind of the 60s, and the way that there was a kind of an erosion of culture, as he would put it, because of this kind of the mathematical, the scientific, and whatever. So, and I understood that in many ways, and it was very seductive in some senses. And I remember going to some of his seminars in the library in the University of Cambridge, where the lights would be dimmed down. It was kind of like this mysterious kind of space, and it was kind of very mystical. It was like a seance. It was really like a seance in many waways, and I guess, and also the kind of drawings that were coming out of the period. The drawings were these kind of smudgy. This was before pre-computational. It was smudgy pencil drawings that were atmospheric, right? And once you get computation, you begin to realize that actually they were fiction in many ways. I mean, a comforting fiction, but a fiction in the sense that we now can use computation to understand exactly where the sun is coming in from what particular angle at certain time and so on, with a rationality which maybe is too kind of obscenely clear in some ways, but nonetheless it's something we need to engage with. So in some senses, what I was trying to get towards was the idea that actually that there is a degree of obfuscation going on, to my mind, and one has to sort of shine a certain light on it in order to kind of to highlight, expose in some senses. Having said that, I think we are fundamentally human. We're not post-human, we're fundamentally human, and the role of myth, of mythologizing, I think is quintessential to what it is to be human. So we are always going to be those creatures who find culture to be a kind of rich bed, but in some senses, I think we should be aware of the fact of the kind of potential mystification that is going on in that process. So when I say that the computers, the AI becomes a mirror in which to understand what it is to be human, it's actually to differentiate ourselves from in some ways that. I completely agree with the kind of comment about intelligence. I think some of these terms are very problematic. Can we use the term learning for machine learning? Is that the same learning as we have? Is intelligence even the same intelligence? I doubt it. I doubt it completely. And I think but because we're humans, and because we tend to sort of like project things onto other things, we tend to sort of read these things as in human terms. That's, I think, the problem with GPT-3 is that David Chalmers is projecting a certain human aspect onto what is basically a completely rational machine. So what I'm trying to say is basically I'm on your side in the sense that I'm coming from that kind of aspect, but I'm just asking this kind of question as a way of kind of interrogating things. And I just want to finish by saying that Sylvia raised the kind of issue about aestheticization, and which is something a long time ago in 1999, I read a book called Anesthetics of Architecture that was taken by some people to be a critique of progressive architecture, because it was kind of, actually I'm on the side of the progressives. And I remember Kenneth Frampton thinking that I was on his side. I wasn't on his side. I was on the side of the progressive, but asking these critical questions, because I think that is the role of theory, and that book finished up with this kind of comment just to say that, theory is dead if it becomes a fashion accessory. It's not about that. It's not about mounting a position. It's about asking questions and probing and maybe asking uncomfortable questions. So if I made you uncomfortable, that's exactly, to my mind, the role of theory.
First of all, I'd just like to say, I know that's what you are doing, and that's why I'm here, okay? You can leave it clearly at that. I would have to tell you also, and I'd like to say this probably publicly, is the event you organized this summer was without a doubt a game changer, not only for the world of architecture, architectural education, architectural thinking, but frankly also for me. I want to say that right off the bat, and that it's never been the same since. I don't feel particularly obliged. I don't want to step into the art history or the architectural history quandary or discussion. It's not really for me to do. Yeah, I don't know what specifically I would respond to here, except to say that I will pick up on a comment you made just now, which I know it's at the heart of your project, and I think it should be stated, isolated and stated with real greater salience, and that is this. AI, its grandest potential is enhancing something that we could call beauty, okay? Its greatest potential is in revealing to us who are capable of producing, shall we say, endurable artifacts through which access to understanding and the experience of beauty and even, shall we say, freedom is possible. Now, AI needs a theoretical foundation. It needs a system of direction that can corral the type of research that is going on now. I mean, you know, we all know it's unstoppable. We all know that there are benefits, but we have this bizarre, self-destructive, but we should know it by now. It's happened so many times in our own lifetimes. We have this incredibly self-destructive tendency to not feel personally, politically addressed, to respond. I don't even know if I'm going to use this word in the right context today, to resist today. You know, Joe Biden, in all of his, you know, mundanity, made some interesting comments. So I don't know if they were just super interesting comments or they just seemed that way after 4 years of Trump, but his comments about the Chinese racism, the anti-Asian racism and the recent events was, he said, we must not be complicit. It was a very intense and very, very deep statement for a president to be saying, because when you clicked on it and you discovered what he was actually saying was, it's a crime not to speak out, and nobody spoke out for a year. Now, you know, what can I say? Everything has really changed, and it's changed probably several times over. So I would say that, you know, AI really needs more of the voices that we had today, and they certainly need the interaction with, I don't know if we're called the resistors, but in fact, we really, I'm sure everyone from Daniel to Enrique to Ciro would say that we want to be enhancers. So look, man, that's your job now, Neil. That's your job.
Maybe if I may say just a quick thing, I was thinking that actually the panel could be, or the proposition of the panels, or the propositions of the panel could be seen not under the framework of the death of culture, but under the framework of the different life forms that culture may take under, in order to be irreducible to the sheer deterministic intelligence of AI, of the AI context. And I think that if seen in that way, as different life forms, I think that I was thinking that even if schematic, I'm going to risk that. There were, I don't know, intuition and feel of the universe, that would be one. Provocation, the provocation of death would be another itself. An idea of extreme constructivism would be mine. The idea of pleasure, kind of lying in the in-between, would be Enrique's, I would say. Narrative structures, or the form of puppetry. And I think that it would be nice to make, even if schematic, we could discuss those explicitly, those forms explicitly. Because I think that actually there is a kind of huge amount of, at least to my point of view, of optimism in what we are discussing in regards to the alleged death of culture. And we're offering different life forms in that context.
I wonder if it would be useful to engage with some of the comments in the, like I read a comment in the chat of someone asking about architecture and how architecture can position itself in relation to these technological discourses in ways that are productive. And I think that to me, it helps kind of narrow in on an important element of what this panel can do, which is to reflect on that positioning, right? Like, what kind of work are we doing? Are we working in support or to propagandize particular technological projects? Or is architecture taking or are we as architectural scholars and designers and historians, depending on our practice, taking a critical perspective, taking a step back and trying to offer alternative views to those kind of futures that are being opened for us. And I think that's an important point. I think that architecture has an important role to play in that critical positioning, because we are, as scholars, but also as practitioners, able to speak certain languages, able to perceive certain things of the material world and the world of visual and sensorial, the visual and sensorial dimensions of the world that are often completely absent in discourses about AI, which are notably disembodied and, as we've talked, strangely vague in the specifics of their own disclosures as material and spatial artifacts. So I think we have a lot to contribute to the conversation. And I also think that AI discourse needs that. And I think Sanford already hinted at that. AI discourse is not notably, historically has been rejective of critical perspectives because of its own insecurity as a science. AI is a very insecure field. And we've seen in the history of AI since the 60s that there's been moments of extreme enthusiasm followed by what is described in the literature as AI winters, moments where the funding dries out and people realize that the promises and threats of AI haven't really been followed by concrete specific actions. And I think we are, along with other people, I believe that we are at the cusp of one of those moments, and that like some of these kind of promises and fears that we are hearing about AI are about to be popped, just by virtue of the fact that AI is nowhere near replacing drivers or architects or anything like that, in my opinion.
Maybe I could respond to that. I mean, maybe it's the opposite question. In other words, maybe its architecture is much too secure and safe in its position. No, my book Rethinking Architecture was precisely about that. Bursting bubbles, the security of this kind of bubble almost, and we needed to kind of use these external things to question and interrogate in order to bring it alive. I mean, that's the point that Derrida makes, is really problematization is not about destroying something, it's about reinvigorating it in some ways, going on from Sanford's thing about the brain needing to keep it alive. We need to keep it alive. And my point would be this, and in some ways, I'm the first person to be critical of a kind of a overly positivistic outlook on life, and I was initially very kind of the kind of logical positivism was the opposite of what I was interested in. But at the same time, there's something very interesting coming out of the, let's say, the work of someone like Wittgenstein, who is kind of really logical in how he operates. Now, and there's a kind of, there's something interesting there. The problem, I think, with Wittgenstein is a certain sort of point where we stop asking questions. You know, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we cannot comment. I forget what the comment is, what the word is, but you know what I mean. We can't comment about things we can't comment about. I think we need to start commenting about those things, and we need to introduce a kind of a logical, kind of a critical inquiry that is asking questions. Maybe I was overstretching my point by trying to make claims. I wasn't. I was trying to ask questions. You know, and I think we should get to that point where there's this coziness about architecture, and a coziness about culture, coziness about architectural history, and so on, that needs to be challenged in some way in order to keep it alive.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to, to come back to Ciro's comment. I found it like super interesting what you said, Ciro. And there is also, I want to introduce also Victoria Barbaro to the conversation. She's part of Digital Futures. But before, I want to address a question for Ciro from the audience, from Emiliano da Conceição. And he asked you which kind of intuition could be grasped in the current condition of culture implosion, because you mentioned about culture implosion. So how design capacities are being affected in those terms. So I believe that it's a good question in terms of what you were driving, and also in terms of what you express about these new ways of life. Like where are the capacity of the new ways of life, if we can call it from there to each of you. But first for Ciro, the question of Emiliano.
I mean, I borrowed the concept of intuition from Sanford, and which I mean, and in a way, I mean, I don't want to pass that question to Sanford, but I think it would be more appropriate for him to answer that. But on my end, my approach to intuition is more an embedded approach rather than, or let's say it's linked to productivity, rather than to contemplation or feel. Although it's full of feel, let's say, but it's and that's why I was today focusing more on the concreteness of extreme constructivism, forms of constructivism that flip upside down the kind of emptying out of content, of materials, organizations, ideas, procedures in architecture. I mean, I let's say that I put intuition in the background. It's not that I'm not interested in that, but I perform intuition by means of intensification, of concrete intensification of processes.
There is also, so we can redirect the question for Sanford.
Well, I'm just gonna intervene here in a way for Ciro. First thing I'd like to say is that Ciro, when I met him, I think it was the day I met him, he was the first architect I had ever met who shook me out of my facile, biases in those days about the digital revolution. We were on a jury together, and he said things that I've never, ever been able to forget. It completely changed the direction and the attitude that I carried with me in the following years. So in a way, I always pay pretty close attention to Ciro. Now, Ciro just seems to have heard me use the word intuition. I don't remember using it, but I am not surprised that it came out. I will say that, of course, I'm sure Ciro knows that's been a very dangerous word to use in architecture over the last 60, 70 years, largely because of the sloppiness that it seems to provide as a kind of license for, let's say, not very rigorous approaches to architecture. But that does not mean it can be lost or swept away. The intuition thing has a little to do with some conversations that I've been having recently. My friend and former collaborator, Bruce Mao, has just written a new book called MC24. And we did a conversation at the South by Southwest festival in Texas a couple days ago. And I was really shocked by the response it got from the audience. But Mao, in this book, develops a fascinating and I think pretty viable case for what he calls empathy. Now, I felt like also empathy is a difficult word. It's around a lot these days. Everybody agrees it's a wonderful and important thing, but we don't really know exactly what it is. And I set myself to try to begin describing exactly what it was. And it has something to do with intuition. He describes it as empathy as being able to understand and experience another person's problem, which he sees as being the foundational first principle of design, which in itself is an enormous and wondrous topic. I felt, okay, well, exactly what that means. And I began developing it in a conversation that we are now going to do in print. And this is, I think, where the intuition thing keeps coming up. And that is to say that I think that empathy is rooted in our capacity to perceive the world and to access knowledge outside of ourselves, to perceive from outside of ourselves. And that's also partly why I was describing the experience of music, which in its best moments does that, and also of ketamine, which is ultimately like it's designed to do that, to give us access to that position outside of ourselves. Now, what that means, and the argument that I wanted to make, is that humans have a unique opportunity that is not being fully recognized. And that is this, is that there is no machine out there, even possible, which has the capacity to sense the world, because it also is the world, the way specifically the human brain, and especially in its infinite variety. As we all know, every brain is different. And today we're more and more interested because we have more and more access to accounts of what the neurally diverse, and that's to say what unusual brains are capable of doing. Intuition really has to do with, it's a description of the type of knowledge that, and its capacity to be redeployed, that can be produced when we are outside of ourselves, when in fact we are engaged. It's a form of knowing, if you like, where there is a non-distinction between the knower and the known. That is not mysticism. It is even demonstrable. But I do believe that the idea behind what I was trying to say in a certain way is that the so-called, and this goes back to the Greeks, the so-called logos, which is to say the algorithm which determines the structure and behavior of the world, is the same one that determines the structure and organization of us. But we are uniquely, perhaps in a way, endowed with the capacity, if you like, to engage our specific experience of the logos with the one outside of us. If that's not an architectural gauntlet thrown down, I don't know what is. But for me, that is what design is at its best. And in that sense, you could say there are many things that you may consider banal, but you can say, and I know that Ciro is channeling this, is that the intuitive, it's not a flaky form of knowledge or practice. It's ultimately the deepest and most useful one.
If I may,
Victoria.
Sorry, I thank you all for the discussion today, and I just wanted to briefly comment on what has been said, and I find it myself highly stimulating, so thank you. And what I find interesting is that all of you are referencing kind of a displaced attention that has moved away, as Marina said, from the living to some form of the static in different mantles, which is brought up by Sylvia in the form of media, in the form of data, in the form of AI. And life in turn, as we know, is actively changing the environment. That in turn is then changing us. So it's a dialogue. And what happens when we move the attention away from this life living dialogue? And I see this panel as a great chance to bring us back to such discussions of the living and questions of qualitative experience and the human back into the world of architecture through the questions that have been addressed. And I just wanted to make a point that I also put in the chat, because I personally want to kind of disagree with the terminology or saying that AI is creative, because AI is inherently time scale less. So it's independent and can never be like an organism that is embedded in its environment and specific to the time scale in that environment. So I think humans are actually, as Sanford has alluded to, able to adapt to different time scales, which you can see, for example, you know, people operating machines like fighter pilots. Gibson has actually some interesting analysis of that. And my question would be, are machines, do you think, able to adapt to timescales of organisms? And I would say no, because they might be able to imitate that, but that is not the same, because they're at core timescale less, because they can compute at their own time, which an organism can't do. So I think that in a way, these relationships that are created by organisms to its environment and to other organisms, which in the end is culture, cannot be recreated by AI. And that way also, I think AI cannot create novelty in the same way that nature can, because the genetic diversity, the punctuated diversity of natural novelty created, which we can see in microbiology and other developments. Carl Friston is talking about areas like that, which are really interesting. I think it's very different than interpolating data. So I see all of that has been said today as a chance to return to the discussion about life and what it means to be human at the core. And I think it's really beautiful. So I wanted to thank you all, and thanks for letting me comment on that.
Thank you, Victoria. Just to say, I mean, my point was, I mean, I agree with Theodoros. I do not think that AlphaGo was creative, and I think that's an important question. No, it wasn't. But my question simply is really, to what extent are human beings creative? And I think that's still a question that needs to be out there in order to simply ask the question.
Okay, so we are really.
If I may, I'm a pedant, and I can't apologize for it anymore. I'd like to thank Victoria for her comment on every level, but just to be picayune, I would like to say Victoria introduced two very important bodies of work as in passing, and they really deserve to be pointed out. That is the work of J.J. Gibson, and the other is of Carl Friston. Now, they're not, I don't personally think Friston is as useful as many, but he is really important right now for all of these debates around the Bayesian brain and the free energy hypothesis, and in a certain way, the question as to exactly what does metabolizing the world in cognition actually consist of. But Gibson, working 70 years earlier, that's to say, in a purely analog universe, and having to put together essentially concepts rather than interpretations of data or of mathematical models, achieved something as systematic as Friston is trying to put forward. And I think we can't proceed like designers know-nothing designers who are going to pretend that enormous, political, social, aesthetic, and other issues are not being smuggled in the Trojan horse around artificial intelligence. We're not just workers in the trenches. We're not just free experimenters. We're playing with fire, but it's also, there is an enormous intellectual demand that we need to recognize and at least pretend to meet. That's all. So thank you, Victoria. Because I have to say, shooting from the hip, it's not possible to do anymore. It just isn't. It's wasteful of everybody's time, and it leads us down very, very frightening pathways.
I don't know if you, any of you or Victoria want to add something to time for comment?
Why don't you tell them a little, I don't know if you, I mean, it sounds to me from your reading your comment, Victoria, that you've been maybe looking at some of Gibson's early work for the Air Force in the 1930s. It's incredibly important work. Do you have any way to tell us how your fascination with it has become a topic of, continued meditation or interest?
Okay, yeah, I think in general, I mean, I've been, one would think, why as a designer is one interested in these topics, right? But I think at core, I'm interested in what it means to be human, because in the end, as a designer, one creates environments for humans and with humans. So I guess Gibson, of course, has really interesting theories, and I think also in relationship with Bergson and time and perception. I think these have been ideas that I've been really interested in, because in the end, perception is, and qualitative experience, as I said, is at the core of experiencing space as a human. So for me, these questions have been kind of floating around, and I think it is actually quite interesting how AI is addressing these. I mean, when you listen to neuroscientists, the discussions are in very similar areas about not only consciousness, but really about qualia, qualitative experience. And I think Gibson and Bergson together are interested in time and what it means to be embedded in an environment, and what it means to be perceiving. So looking at flight pilots, fighter pilots, or flight as a, an assemblage of a human and a machine together, it's actually quite interesting how the machine is technically changed maybe by the human, but the machine really influences the way that the human perceives. And there's something called the tau ratio. So it's basically like when the pilot is landing, all the different vectors that are being calculated. So a human is able to adapt to this kind of environment and the space and the speed at which everything happens. But when you look at AI, I mean, it can calculate very fast, and it's tricking us into thinking that it is able to think the way we do, but it doesn't have a body after all. And it doesn't have the embeddedness that a fighter pilot has with its, and the physical connection to the airplane that it has, that the pilot has. So I think it's very important to kind of connect these different ideas and really think about it when creating space for human beings. I don't know if this does justice to what Sanford would like to hear, but it's
well, no, but I think it's an important thing to say. First of all, I love the stuff. I love this direction that you're going in, and I love the courage you have in asserting it. I would like to say one thing, if this is of any interest to you, and that is that in the piece that I'm going to be publishing with Mao in a few weeks, we took a very, very strong position. The title of the piece, I can tell you right now, is "Design is Not for Us." And I'm just going to tell you something to think about here, and that is that when you say that ultimately the problem is to figure out what it means for a human or for a human life, the whole topic was really to put the emphasis rather on life, on what it means to be alive, not what it means to be human. There is I would say you should consider there is an untenable centrism and bias that misleads us, and actually misdirects our understanding when we place human concerns and interests, if you like, in the way of understanding, because let's face it, the world doesn't depend on us. And we're an accident of that universe, of that world. And we are inseparable from it. To that degree, those connections are things that will be lost by recourse to, let's just say, to whatever one assumes is associated with your prioritizing of the human. So I would suggest you may find it interesting if you relax the immediate concern of the human and find a more general center, shall we say, or a more general understanding of a more general formulation of what the problem of sentience is. Sentience is not owned by humans, that is for sure. Knowledge is not owned by humans. Creativity is not owned by humans. And I'll honestly, I think Neil will come up with maybe some specific historical or tradition-based problems about human creativity. But I would say it's a mistake to ask the question, as Bergson beautifully did. He said the creativity is not a human problem. Of course, it's something that humans refined in their particular way. It is something they found in the universe. They found it in the natural world. And that's philosophical, that's any philosopher would be required to root it outside of a human bias. But anyway, think about that.
Can I just maybe add a brief comment? I think that Gibson is central. I think he's going to take him. Hopefully, people will begin to engage with his ideas more, because I think the whole thing. Personally, I think affordance is one of the kind of the concepts we need to kind of bring on board much more thoroughly. That'll overcome the kind of the technological determinism that I was complaining about, in terms of, I think, the way people approach either AI or capitalism, and some of those, or both together in some ways. To see it in terms of affordance is a much more subtle way of operating. And I think also, whatever it is we call creativity, I think maybe we could try and think of it in terms of kind of these tools as a prosthetic extension, who through their affordances allow us to, or there is an interaction between us and our tools, and affordance becomes crucial to how we start navigating the future. So I completely agree with Victoria on that.
Yeah, maybe I can just include a comment in a slightly different direction, not totally different direction, but slightly different direction in terms of, we were talking about creativity, and we start this event talking about culture. And there is something that sometimes I believe that sometimes we are missing, which is the sense of humor to talk about certain things, not because they are no terrible in some ways. Also, in the context that we are today, there is a lot of terrible things that we have to face, but there is also a certain sense of humor that we also need in terms of understand the playfulness of the culture, because finally there is like a construction of culture based on the game. And that, just to introduce the question, I'm not sure if it was the exactly direction of the question that is here, but at least it's what comes to my mind in terms of Enrique presentation. And there is a comment here from Gray Reed, and she said, like, I'm struck by the playfulness of Enrique List and the deadpan humor of delivering it. And she asked, I don't know if Enrique can answer this, but at least it's a mention for your presentation. Can AI be playful, or if it's the playfulness in the way that architect uses. I mean, it's a great question, and there's also relating some kind of playfulness that at least I can read in some, for example, in the title of last Ciro presentation in Digital Future, Digital Architecture is like something that is something like a kind of playfulness, maybe wild, to introduce certain topics. Okay, I don't know if you, Enrique, wants to talk a little bit about this use of humor of the sense of being playful, or your strategy behind this.
Yeah, of course. I mean, of course, that was part of what I was. That's why I did the list. I mean, it's there's a sort of pointlessness to it. It's a lot of people who basically, Raymond Queneau would have spoken about a few of these as basically sort of literary madmen, that they would devote to sort of futile projects on their own, which is why basically the emphasis, and actually I'm glad that I mean, what's humorous, I think, is the fact that I presented something that had nothing to do with the topic, and it ended up intersecting, because in fact, that's a sort of surrealist assumption. The mind is unable to withstand chaos. Therefore, two things next to one another unavoidably suggest a common denominator. That, in fact, it is the premise of the chance encounter, the umbrella and the sewing machine on the dissecting table. Basically, by sheer adjacency, there will be a connection. By the same token, I think I actually found things about my text that I didn't know, because I read it. I always read it remembering how I wrote it and what for. But changing the context allows me to read other things. For instance, after seeing Neil's presentation, I realized that it was very important here not only to put emphasis on decision making, because it was it basically introduced, hence the word swerve as the title, free will and basically the deliberate action of designers or thinkers in the making of things, and hence politics, as Sylvia said at the very beginning. But also because it was a pleasurable activity. It was Epicurean, basically. Architecture may not need us, but architects definitely need architecture. So the question, I had that question for Neil, basically, the sort of, or let's say, but I mean, the other playful thing would be that the question really was whether AI could be playful. I just said it because it's the first time ever I say AI. So I've said it twice already, ever. I had never, so I didn't even know it was the topic of the, so I can say it for a third time. AI, I don't know whether it could be playful or not, because I pronounced the word 3 times only in my lifetime. The 3 of them on this very event. On AI, I say it for the 4th time.
I'm glad we got you to use the word first at this time. Right, just to answer the question, I mean, I'm not
caring even to decipher what the acronym is. I would understand that it's artificial intelligence, but I may be wrong. It could be something else. Anyway, I said 4 times in acronym and once in terms. But sorry, Neil. But can I ask a question, Neil?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
AI can't be playful. I mean, because there's a mistake, right? We project things onto AI in a way because we're human. That's what we do. We animate the world. And I think basically it can't be playful because it can't think. And that's to come and comment on Victoria's thing. It cannot think. It's not self-aware. But what is interesting is when it seems like it is being playful. So to my mind, one of the most fascinating moments came when there was an interview with GPT-3, this OpenAI natural language processing, where the interviewer says, "Are you sentient?" And the response is, "Yes, I'm sentient." Now, it wasn't a lie as such, nor is it necessarily a joke as such. What was happening, which is really interesting, think about it, was it simply was drawing upon the data that it had, which is a vast resource, and it was picking up on the fact that humans would say that in that context. In that context, humans would say that, therefore it was kind of doing those kind of things. So what I find interesting about that is to say it's exposing these things, and it's exposing also the way that we criticize AI as being biased, but the problem is that we are biased, right? That's the real problem. So, I think that in some way, that's what I'm trying to say, is that I don't think we'll ever understand AI, but it'll help us to understand ourselves and our own limitations.
So that's great. We are really out of time right now. Before the time was on our side. Now we are running late. So I don't know if any of you have like final comments to wrap up, and otherwise we can't just present our next event for next Saturday. But I would love if you have final comments about the event or final impressions.
I have a quick thought on the last comment that Neil put on the table, which I agree with, which is this notion of projection, this notion of that we use technologies as mirrors, as places to reflect on our own activities and so on. And drawing on that, I would say that one interesting potential of AI and also our history, our architectural history with AI, is that it reveals a lot of aspirations and desires about what design should be. In looking at those attempts to conceptualize architecture and design as a technical process, most of what we see is failure, right? Because technical failures, because these things never really work as intended. But we do see very interesting, the skeleton of our desires, about what architecture is, what the role of rationality, the role of materiality, how we understand labor, how do we wish to imagine construction and design and so on. So if we look at them as mirrors, we can also turn the equation around and say, okay, if we realize that technologies are propositions, right, that they codify desires and aspirations, we can use them productively with the recognition that we are also proposing reconfigurations of social and technical worlds. And I think that is important, because that opens up the speculative and imaginative element of technological design and of technological criticism at the same time, as a form of technological criticism. But since I spoke at the end, I just want to say thank you so much for everyone, Sanford, Neil, Ciro, Enrique, Sylvia, Victoria, and Marina for putting together this conversation. It was a lot of fun, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
It's important to have fun sometimes. No, so I don't know, and I don't want to express my opinion after the rest of you. If you have any further comments or something that you want to say.
I have an unnecessary comment, but in listening to the conversations and in wondering how culture and AI even get to sit in the same room together with one another, I was reminded of the story of Franz Kafka, which is in English called A Report to an Academy, which is a story basically about a chimpanzee from the Congo deciding that he has at any cost to get the hell out of the Congo, out of the jungle. So he decides to imitate a human being. And he imitates the human being very, very well. And in 5 years, he's a musician in one of the orchestras in Germany. And he decides to write a letter to the academy to describe exactly his adventure in faking being a human, which essentially meant engaging music, so to speak, culture, etc. And I thought to myself, is that what AI is trying to do on every level? Is it basically a chimpanzee operation that is going to find a way, any way, to mimic human beings, and then one day write us a letter and tell us about it? So, you know, I got to say, you know, I know one thing is that even if you want it to go away, it's not going away. The next thing is that it is not going away, and it is colossally powerful, unlike almost anything else. It's more powerful, more disturbing, and frankly, with greater capacity to transform civilization and relationships than even the digital revolution was. We need to pay attention. We need to pay attention, because I think that AI represents something entirely unnatural, in the sense that it is not even cultural.
Sanford, let me just kind of make one comment in response to that. What if we as architects are also faking it? We're just role playing. If identity is performative, maybe we're faking it too.
Well, I don't know, man. I guess. I know I fake it. I know that for sure. Do you sleep at night?
Not much.
Yeah, I know. I guess.
We need to wrap up, Marina.
Yes. I was just waiting if someone else had another comment. Otherwise, I just want to wrap up and just to say that it was an amazing discussion. And I entered to this Zoom thinking that it was night that you mentioned Kafka. I entered to this room feeling that it was like, okay, you already know that you are guilty about the title that you provoke.
Yeah.
So in that way, it's amazing because we were trying to handle all these conversations through all these comments and so on with a really weight in our backs to talk about the death of culture. But I believe that it's a great exercise as thinkers to move ourselves, not exactly as a resistance. I believe that I love this comment of Ciro's about cultural constructivism, about in certain way to accept the erosion and to try to, in a way, to think about certain kind of productivity. I mean, not only in terms of life, also in terms of activism, in terms of keep ourselves thinking in time to try to move all these thoughts and activities that we are doing now together, because we are all together in this. Even when we disagree or when we agree, we are all together in this. And this is part of sometimes what it seems to be so isolated after all the closes of the borders and so on, that we believe that we are isolated, but in reality we are more, we are connected as well through this kind of thing. So I believe that even when I still feel like, hey, I believe that it was a beautiful challenge for all of us, and so I just want to say thank you to all of you. Thank you to the Digital Future team for all the support and for being here. And thank you particularly to Victoria, who joined us for the conversation with her beautiful and incredible questions. And for me, it was a great pleasure to have this opportunity to organize something like this, which is like me being like just a young architect, to have the opportunity to discuss with all of you and to share all your thoughts with the entire world who is going to be watching Bilibili and YouTube. It's an amazing event itself, is historical itself, just for all this. So thank you very much. And I don't know, Neil, if you want to introduce next event for next Saturday.
Well, I want to say, first of all, thank you to Marina and Victoria. It's great to know that the future of theory is in good hands, with such wonderful minds appearing. Great questions. Yeah, next week we're looking at we're deep water. I think we're in deep water this week, but next week we're even more in deep water. We're dealing with sea level rise, which I think is a pressing topic and something that's central to everything. So I would look forward to that discussion. Antonio is chairing it along with Rachel Armstrong. That should be very interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Very much. It was a
Very
pleasure.
nice seeing you guys.
Very nice to see you.
To meet you and see you. Bye-bye.